Preface and Introduction to Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War. Recorded by Céline Major. Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War, by Annie Wittenmyer. Preface. In preparing this little volume for publication, no attempt whatever has been made to record as facts of history the military movements of the Army during our recent Civil War. The great captains who led the Union forces through the terrible conflict from Fort Sumter to Appomattox have already covered, to a large extent, the military history of the war. My purpose has been simply to bring out in connection with these great military events, with which they were so intimately connected, a few of the many incidents and heart histories that were crowded into my own life, from April 20th, 1861, to November 23rd, 1865. The stories and reminiscences in this book are true to life, every one of them. They are told just as they occurred, without any attempt at literary embellishment, and most of them can be substantiated by living witnesses. Camps and hospitals were established near my own home in Keokuk, Iowa, early in April 1861. I began at once my ministrations to the sick in these newly established hospitals, and during my daily visits, closed the eyes of the first Iowa soldier who died in the war. From that time on till the close of the war, I was actively engaged all along the lines. I was loyally and generously sustained by the women of Iowa; was elected by the Iowa legislature sanitary agent of the state; was commissioned by Iowa's grand old war governor, Samuel J. Kirkwood; was furnished by Secretary Stanton with a pass to all parts of the field, and government transportation for myself and supplies. This official order of Mr. Stanton's was supplemented by the following charge: "It is especially enjoined upon all officers to furnish this lady every facility in carrying out her generous purposes, it being shown that she is worthy of great respect." I had also the cooperation of the Sanitary and Christian Commissions, and the chief medical officers and government officials, so that I had unusual facilities for doing good. I was greatly indebted to General and Mrs. Grant for sympathy and aid. When Mrs. Grant was at her husband's headquarters the place was a haven of rest for me, and a welcome always awaited me. Indeed, Mrs. Grant would have joined me in the work, but her husband was afraid her strength and sympathies would be overtaxed. During these brief visits I learned to appreciate the unselfishness and noble qualities of General Grant, and the strength and purity of his character; and the loveliness and sterling worth of Mrs. Grant and her wifely devotion. I was also under great obligations to General John A. Logan, who was ever ready to aid me. When it was almost impossible to get from Bridgeport to Chattanooga, he sent me up in a little steamer which he loaded with my supplies. Later I met Mr. Orson, the president of the United Telegraph Association; and General Logan introduced me with such kindly appreciative words that without a hint from either of us, he filled out an order allowing me "to telegraph free to the end of the war." I still have that little order in my possession. It is due our brave soldiers that I should say I felt as safe in their midst as I would have done in my own home, even though at times I was the only woman in the midst of an army of 20,000 fighting men, as was the case at Milliken's Bend after the repulse of General Sherman at Haines' Bluff. Not one impertinent or rude word was ever spoken to me in all those years. No purer or grander army ever marched to the music of fife and drum than the army that stood for the defense of our flag and the unity of our government from 1861 to 1865. A woman could walk in their midst in white, and a little child would have been as safe as in its mother's arms. As I was all along the lines from Vicksburg to Petersburg, and was on some of the bloodiest battlefields, and as I followed Sherman's army along the fiery lines from Chattanooga to Atlanta, I necessarily had to pass through many perils, and witness many exciting scenes. A few of these stories I have now thought best to publish. For more than 20 years my friends have urged their publication; but I shrank from the task because of their personal character. In giving these simple, true stories to the public, I shall hope that the same earnest, charitable spirit will be exercised by my readers, as I manifested toward the sick and wounded during my army work. Annie Wittenmyer, Sanatoga, Pennsylvania, December 3rd, 1894. Introduction. The author of this most interesting and historic volume, Mrs. Annie Wittenmyer, I very often met whilst on my frequent visits to the headquarters of my husband, General Ulysses S. Grant. She there on her mission of mercy as she came to the front with supplies for the sick and wounded. I there simply to give the General a glimpse of his dear ones, some of the children being always with me. And I would gladly have joined Mrs. Wittenmyer in all her works of devotion; but the General forbade it, saying, when I returned from the hospitals laden with petitions and heart‐breaking stories, "Julia, cease, cease, I cannot listen. I hear this all day, every day, and I must have some rest from all this sorrow and misery. If you insist on going again to the hospitals, I will have to send you home." Mrs. Wittenmyer was ever deeply interested in her efforts to relieve suffering; ever appealing for the discharge of the brave men who were made helpless by their wounds; ever braving dangers and enduring hardships in the performance of her self‐assumed patriotic heart duties. I used to look upon this brave, heroic woman with profound respect and admiration, which, if it were possible, has grown the greater in the 30 years that have passed since then. Julia Dent Grant, 2108 R Street, Washington, D.C., November 27th, 1894. End of Preface and Introduction.